Over the last decade, we've seen very good performance and availability of the Collins-class submarine post the rectification issues that flew out of the Coles review. The ABC earlier this year ran a program on the Four Corners program, in fact earlier this month in May, talking about issues with the Collins class. Would you care to put on the public record your response to the claims that were made during that program?
Thank you, Senator. Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, Chief of Navy. The discussion in the Four Corners piece included a number of interviews with commentators and myself, a representative from Anduril as well. The interview that I conducted was about an hour and a quarter, sitting in front of a bright light in my office, and I think it amounted to a couple of minutes curated for the Four Corners show. That's the context behind the article, as I understand it. There was criticism of Collins class availability. For the record, we are achieving benchmark availability. I made that clear during the interview, and I was transparent about the challenges that we've had as a result of the COVID-19 impact on workforce mobility in Australia, as well as on the supply chain, as well as the additional sustainment overhead that ASC had to deal with after the fire we had in HMAS Waller. So for my part, we were very transparent about the challenges, about the capability, about the issues that we have overcome, and I remain impressed, frankly, by ASC and industry's response in achieving the availability that we did over the last couple of years, particularly during the pandemic. I'd highlight that we didn't dip below 86% availability, which is a high distinction in any university that I've attended. And when you put the challenges into context like that, I'm particularly impressed by our industry partners and the availability that we've achieved. And I'm proud that we're back achieving benchmark availability.
Could you just confirm for the committee what you consider to be benchmark availability?
Thank you, Senator.
3 of 6
That's
votes,
4 submarines available to the fleet commander, of which 2 are likely to be in maintenance, and the other 2 will be either available for operations, they might be in a leave period, and that's currently the status of the force.
And that benchmark is set against global standards or against historic achievement within Australia?
It's a direct result of the Coles review, that the targets that were set during the Coles review that you discussed with the ASC CEO last Friday, Senator.
Sure. So in the 23-24 PPS, the sustainment funding for Collins, not LOTE, just Collins, is $717 million, which is an increase from the previous year. Do you expect that that kind of funding will be required for the remaining life of type for Collins to keep the availability that you're currently getting?
Senator, I think this is something we need to watch very carefully. HMAS Collins is 26 years old, as is HMAS Anzac, one of our surface combatants. Just last week, I signed a directive, an internal directive in Navy to review the sustainment provision against the current operating environment, and by that I also mean the economic environment, to ensure that we have sufficient sustainment availability for both of those classes of vessels in particular. They are the workhorses, if you like, in many respects of the Navy, and it's important, as you know, to make sure that we provision enough sustainment to achieve the operational output expected and required of us by government.
Sure. There's 2 more quick questions on Collins before I go to LOTE for Collins. In terms of the maintenance workforce, the uniformed maintenance workforce as distinct to ASC, where do you currently stand, and do you have any critical gaps?
Thank you, Senator. I'd refer to earlier testimony in the Senate about the workforce challenges across the ADF. We're not immune. The size of the submarine force is still twice the size of the submarine force when I was commanding a Collins submarine many years ago. It is healthy in many respects, but we need to keep a weather eye on particularly our technical workforce, who work very, very hard to keep these submarines ready for all contingencies. and they're in high demand. They are high quality, highly trained, highly experienced technical sailors, the men and women that sustain these submarines in uniform. And I'm focused on keeping every one of them in uniform and growing that force.
So could you give us a little more clarity around particular initiatives that you are taking to keep those sailors in the service of the Navy, and if you, by extension, talk about your work with ASC to make sure their workforce remains stable, because they're a critical enabler for you, particularly in the context of Virginia-class starting to absorb Australian personnel and then down the track the work up to the AUKUS submarine.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I'll go back a few years to when I was the Deputy Chief of Navy and we established the Navy Retention Initiative, which in many respects is a precursor to the current ADF-wide retention initiative. That was targeted at the personnel who are approaching the end of their initial enlistment period to encourage further service. That was very successful. The majority of people who were eligible to receive that retention payment accepted it. And we, during that period leading up to the pandemic, we actually grew the permanent workforce in Navy by almost 2,000 people. We drove separation rate down to the lowest it had been on record. Then the challenge of the pandemic arose. And as we heard earlier, it's a tough workforce and employment environment.
This is all very good, but we're quite limited for time. Could you specifically look at the particular measures that you're looking at to retain your workforce engagement with ASC and considerations around AUKUS submarine? Particular measures, initiatives, discussions you're having around that?
The submarine force is the beneficiary of deliberately differentiated remuneration arrangement. That remuneration arrangement is reviewed periodically. That is currently under review in light of this year's announcements around the optimal pathway. Now that we have clarity around the size, scope and growth rate for the future submarine requirement, it's appropriate that we conduct that full review of remuneration. Of course, that is going to be, as is necessary, in partnership with the broader defence, and the new Chief of Personnel will have a key role to play. That's the principal mechanism, remuneration. Other initiatives have been rolled into that whole of workforce approach, some of which were spoken to by Deputy Secretary of Defence People Group earlier this morning.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back to your next estimates to actually see how you're tracking on some of those measures, particularly if you could identify for us on notice any critical trades where you are short in terms of people for the Collins class. With regard to life type extension for Collins, going back to the original scope, was going to be all 6 propulsion, diesel engines, generators, power conversion, distribution systems, optronics, and I think there were 2 tranches, packages A and B. Has any of that changed as a result of DSR and the subsequent budget reprioritisation?
Thank you, Senator. It's still 6 submarines. I'm going to refer to Mr John Chandler in Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Group for further detail.
Thank you. Mr Chandler.
Senator John Chandler, First Assistant Secretary, Submarines, and just for clarity of the committee, I work within the Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Group, not part of a nuclear submarine task force. So in terms of the LOTE scope for the Collins class, essentially Defence is taking a risk-based approach to defining the scope of that effort, and it's really the most significant risks to extending the life of the class by 1 operating cycle of 10 years, preceded by 2 years.
Mr Chandler, as I said to Admiral Hammond before, we're limited for time. ASC have on their website the last formally endorsed scope, which I understand they're in contract for, which included all those elements and all 6 boats. Could you just clarify whether any of that scope is under consideration as part of the DSR or subsequent budget considerations?
The scope that's currently approved is for the design of the elements that you mentioned, plus the procurement of the long lead items, and I'm not aware of any of those being under consideration as part of the DSR, Senator.
Okay, so the contract that is in place, and I note in this budget it's $160 million for 23-24, which is an uplift from 104 last year. That funding is purely for NRE or non-recurring engineering activities around life of type extension, is that correct?
Non-recurring engineering and long lead item procurement, Senator.
Okay, so it still provides the option for government to choose to de-scope the life of type extension even after that NRE work is done?
Yes, Senator, the implementation of the Collins life of type extension and the extent of that remains a future government decision.
Okay, is there any indication, given that we are expecting the first to be, I think it's Farncombe in 2026, is there any indication as to when that decision will be made?
It will be in the coming period, Senator. Obviously, the decision needs to be made in time to commence the life of type extension for Farncombe from mid-2026. In terms of an indication of the government's inclination, there was a range of comments from, like, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister in the wake of the AUKUS announcement, to the effect that the full life of type extension remains the intent.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With the contract that you have with ASC, is it just the one contract? Because as I look through Oz tender for Collins writ large, I see about 8 core contracts, and my search hasn't been exhaustive, but so far I've come across 19 amendments, some of which are in excess of $40 million, which is nearly half the allocated budget last year. So how many contracts do you have with ASC relating to LOTE?
Relating to LOTE, Senator?
Yes.
I did watch the testimony with Mr Wiley on Friday. So Defence has one contract with ASC for support to the Collins class submarines. It's the same in-service support contract, head contract, that covers ongoing sustainment work, the life of type extension project, and a range of capability upgrades, most notably the C-1439 phases projects.
So you said you have one head contract, and Oz tender there are 8 core contracts, and then, as I said, I've found at least 19 amendments to those. I accept that the Coles review said we shouldn't have an omnibus contract, that we should have more distinct contracting to improve productivity within ASC and value for money for Navy. But are all of those contracts under the ASDEFCON framework?
Yes, Senator. They're all under the one head contract. There will be that head contract is reasonably flexible. It's a strategic contract, been in place since 2012. Quite a sophisticated contract, does allow for additions to the contract scope, but fundamentally one head contract, and ASDEFCON based head contract.
Sure. So with the contract specifically for life of type extension work, does that include, as per Defence's ASDEFCON framework, I think it's Annex A should include the FPS. Does that include the FPS?
I'd have to take on notice, Senator, the way that it's represented. However, with the FPS terminology and OCD terminology, and I followed your questioning with Mr Wiley last week, essentially the approach with the life of type extension of Collins is to maintain the current functional baseline, and I'll just use that in a plain English sense. It's born of a previous time where that was captured essentially at a subsystem specification level. But there is a functional baseline that ASC has been responsible for maintaining as part of the core services under the in-service support contract since its inception, and that if the intent of the LOTE project is to maintain that existing functional baseline, the ASC was already managing it for us. So I don't believed it was needed to be provided to them because it's already part of their ongoing management, and the life of type extension project is driving to maintain that functional baseline.
So, Mr Chandler, is your evidence to the committee today that life of type extension is purely an obsolescence process, because previous testimony and statements by defence and I believe governments have been that this is actually a capability uplift to make sure there is no capability gap whilst we're waiting originally for the attack and now for the AUKUS submarines. That your statement appears to be at odds today. Could you clarify that your evidence is that this is purely an obsolescence exercise?
Senator, I'll say that the intent and objective of the LOTE project scope is to treat the highest risk to extending the service life of the class by one operating cycle. In looking to maintain the current functional baseline with new types of technology, there is always the opportunity to introduce additional capability in the course of essentially an upkeep treatment.
Chief of Navy, as a capability manager, what is your evidence to the committee today about whether the intent of LOTE was both making the boats available for another cycle, but also a capability uplift? What is your evidence?
Senator, Vice Admiral Hammond, Chief of Navy, I'm focused on sustainability, availability and lethality dividends from the life of type extension. I think, as Mr Chandler highlighted, in retiring obsolescence we will gain a capability dividend. So I see alignment, I don't see a point of difference. There's no point in having a submarine that's just able to submerge and stay safe. It needs to be able to remain undetected and achieve the aim as well. So my eyes on all three, the availability, sustainability and lethality, and they are the three pillars around which we have discussions as we get closer and closer to the life of type extension.
So even if you use the terminology a capability dividend, that will by definition change the design and integration requirements for the operational concept that you will have with an enhanced capability. Is it also your position that ASC doesn't require a functional performance specification or an OCD for the life of type with the capability dividend that will be delivered?
Effectively, Senator, that's correct. We're not changing the nature of our submarine operations. We're not changing the operational concepts that we apply. We are ensuring that we're still able to meet the contemporary submarine operational output in the contemporary operating environment through one more operating cycle.
Okay, well, can I ask you, Mr Chandler, I think you said you'd take on notice whether one had been provided. ASC's evidence was they thought it had been. You're now telling the committee that you don't think it's required. There seems to be a deal of confusion there. So can you take on, from Defence's part, whether those annexes which are required as part of ASDEFCON have been provided, and if so, the date when they were provided, and if not, whether there was a deliberative decision to not provide them, and if so, by whom and when?
Yes, Senator. I'm happy to take that on notice. I believe that's what Mr Wiley did as well. And the reason I'm pausing is that I think that the functional baseline that ASC is maintaining to has been part of their existing remit since the inception of the in-service support contract. So that would be the reason why it was not provided specifically for the LOTE project. But I'm happy to take that on notice.
I'd be interested to understand if there were any other similar programs where we're seeing an uplift in capability where Defence is not following basic systems engineering process, which is at the very front end to provide to people who are doing that detailed design both the operational concept and particularly the FPS type of information. You can take that on notice as well.
I'm not sure that I need to, Senator. I think we are following quite orthodox systems engineering approach to the life of type extension project. The fact that the functional baseline that we're maintaining is a particular form reflective of history, and that might not be the classical form of a functional performance specification in contemporary terms, is just a reflection of the passage of time. But essentially, I feel we are employing a fairly consistent systems engineering approach, just given the nature of the baseline that we're maintaining.
Okay, thanks, Chair.